Welcome to the Construction Marketers Podcast, where we teach you how to create the best content in construction. I'm your host, Jonathan Core, and today we're chatting with Alex Horton. Alex is the founder of Alex Horton Creative, a podcast strategy and production company built for construction companies. Welcome to the show, Alex.
Howdy, how you doing, man?
I'm doing really good. It's the end of the week. Obviously, you and I were talking before this. There's a lot of meetings in and out of calls, and so I'm glad that we're ending the day on this note to be able to just talk shop about podcasting.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, this is exactly the same as the meetings I've had today, but I think the stakes feel lower. So hopefully, not that the other calls weren't fun, they were, but because we're calling it a podcast, I think it just feels different.
Yeah, for sure. And so before we get into it, I want to preface it for both you, Alex, as well as the listeners. We want and I'm not saying you won't, but we want the unfiltered, we want the raw, we want the real Alex. We want you to, I'm going to have a few prompts, few different questions, and it's
Mm.
okay for us to disagree and all sort of stuff. I think the goal here is just to share your perspective as it relates to construction and podcasting, as well as other just content mediums. So I just want to say that
Yeah,
before we get started.
great. I'm ready.
Cool. So yeah, so the post I want to start with is a post I made a few months ago about podcasting, and it definitely ruffled some feathers within the industry, considering I was just on some of these podcasts being interviewed. And so the post, I'll go ahead and read it, and we'll riff from there. So it's the hot take. So we don't need another interview based podcast, but that's what everyone thinks they need to do to start a podcast. But before you start a podcast, think of this. If you start a podcast where you interview others, you position them as subject matter experts. If you start a podcast sharing your thoughts, ideas, and perspectives, you position yourself as a subject matter expert. Now, if you start a podcast where you invite guests and you can both discuss your thoughts, ideas, and perspective, you position both of you as subject matter experts. And I recommend the latter. So, based on this post that I made on LinkedIn, obviously I got some interesting remarks on it. What are your initial reactions to it, Alex?
Man, I do think that a lot of people think that the uh, kind of conversation podcast is an interview. Like, I think when they listen to it, they think it's going to be an interview, or they think that what they're listening to is an interview. Maybe that's the clearer way to say that. And so I have noticed working on other podcasts, when folks are brought in to have a conversation, they often kind of put themselves in the position of being interviewed versus having a conversation. And so I mean, to me, it's not that hot of a take. I think that's just correct, and that's certainly how I would feel. But I'm curious to hear from your perspective, like why uh, some folks did not like that you put that out there.
Yeah, so I can't remember one specific comment, like exactly the comment. I just know who did, and someone, I think someone says, "Hey, you're ruffling feathers" or something like that. But I think it was partly like maybe serious, partly joking. But the reason say it, and I said it, and I'm glad you agree with at least the premise
Hmm.
of what I said, is I see a lot of construction podcasts out there that are interview based. Hey, we just want to get guests, and it's very guest focused. But I
Hmm.
realize for me, kind of reverse engineering the type of content that I listen to, although I do like interesting guests that they have on, I feel like I built an affinity towards the actual hosts and their takes and their perspective. So I come back not only interested to learn about maybe an interesting guest that they have, but more I'm like, okay, what does John or this person think about construction or marketing or content, all sort of stuff. And that's honestly the premise as far as where it came from. But when I see people start a podcast, and I'm sure you see it all the time too. Hey, we're starting a podcast. The play is always, hey, we're just going to interview people, give them the platform, which I don't think is a bad strategy.
Mm-mm.
But in my opinion, I'm like, what's the goal? And I think it always goes back to why are you starting this podcast to begin with?
Yeah, I think you're right on. I do think it's funny that you're ruffling feathers. Like, that could be totally sarcastic, like it's not that big of a deal. Or I think, to your point, I some people might be like, "Hey, that's exactly what I'm doing." Wait, hold on. Why did you say that? Um, with the like guest centered podcast, you're right, it removes the host from being like a subject matter expert. But when I think of the podcast that I like, and really any podcast, so many podcasts that do very, very well, um, it's never because the guests are just so amazing. Like, there might be some value, and like there are a lot of episodes where there's wisdom that comes from the guest, but it's all anchored on the host and who they are. If I was if there was a podcast where I was obsessed with the guests and hated the host, I'm not going to listen because the guests are so good. Like, if I find an author, or if I find a personality or an athlete or whoever, if I'm searching for just more of their content, the podcast they've been on. If I'm searching, let's say here's like an obvious like big front one. Um, let's say Seth Godin, who he's super smart. He's been on a lot of podcasts. He's very well spoken. Is just such a great like speaker. I had a phase where I was like looking for every podcast episode he was on, and they'd get going, and I would turn some of them off. And it's not because he's bad, because like I want to listen to him. It's that like the host, they're not playing the role that maybe that I expect, but I think probably more likely is, they're not positioning themselves as bringing anything to the conversation. And so I would, kind of go from that phase to I've been listening to a lot of. Have you ever listened to Ali Abdal?
Yeah, he's great content, great guy.
He's awesome, super smart. Um, he's just really great at creating content, and content that like means something. And he does these really long podcasts, and there are plenty of very, very long podcasts out there. Obviously, Joe Rogan's another one. And a big part of the value for me is I love the way he asks questions, because it's real curiosity. And so like I think even though his guests are, a lot of them are successful entrepreneurs, or authors, or whoever they are, that having that balance between a genuinely curious and engaging host who not just asks questions but like provides their own insight, like, to me that's when it becomes you're like a fly on the wall. But I can get a list of questions read by a celebrity or led by a thought leader. I can get that anywhere. And so I think with podcasts, to me, it is that balance between, it shouldn't be host focused and it really shouldn't be guest focused. It's, how can you position everybody on the podcast to be, um, a subject matter expert who can really, I don't know, bring value. That feels like very business focused, but it's like who can show up and be real and have a real conversation, and not just like, I'm so happy you're here. Thanks for answering the things I wrote down before we started.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm curious, kind of like you obviously mentioned Ali, and he's got great content. There's different creators I follow too that are kind of in a similar like a pool of people. One of the things you
Mhm.
said though is if you like somebody, you'll typically go and find. Like I've done the same thing. If like Ali has been kind of on a podcasting sprint because he released his book or something like that,
Yeah.
and so he's getting on different podcasts. There's another guy too, Noah Kagan. I think he also just recently released a book, and he's doing the same thing. And so it's
Yep.
interesting. I was listening to a podcast specifically, and maybe this might be why you're leaving. You'll end up clicking away from some of these podcasts that they're on, is because questions. I think podcast prep, research, all that sort of stuff influences how high quality the conversation is going to be. And I was listening to a podcaster who literally said before he interviews somebody, he'll go watch 10, 20 actual interviews of questions that they were asked. So that way he comes up with a list of, yeah, you want to lay the foundation for who they are, some of that up, like their story. But he's like, I want to be able to ask them questions that they've never been asked for. Cause it's
Mhm.
interesting to hear like the person being interviewed, when you're asked a question, they'll always be like, oh, wow, I've never been asked that. And that's kind of the recipe for a really good conversation. Cause it's like, oh, wow, this person did their research. And so this is going to be really interesting to riff on it. The question I want to ask you though, is as far as the type of content that you consume yourself on from a podcast medium, what's the archetype of podcasts that are appealing to you specifically as it really, because I know you're a podcaster, you have
Mm.
a podcast
Yeah.
agency, but what are some of the qualities or characteristics that you look for in a good podcast that you consume yourself?
Hmm. I would say either some level of expertise or um, someone who is highly curious. That would probably be in terms of like conversational podcasts. I also really like some narrative type things. Like I loved Serial when it came out, and S Town. Some of those really story based podcasts, but um, like I don't necessarily need a host or kind of the main driver of a podcast to be um, an expert in anything they're talking about. I think what is easier to relate to is if somebody's really curious because if they're hopefully they're asking questions that I'm asking in my head. And so I think that's usually why I relate to those kind of podcasts more. But also, like, when I'm working with clients, I'm trying to bring curiosity when somebody is really flexing their expertise, trying to like balance that out. Because I mean, those are the two things I love about good podcasts, and I think that good podcasts should have both expertise and curiosity built in. That's just me.
Yeah, for sure, and I think I'm sure this is kinda woven in that too is, like, the entertainment factor. Like, even through the
Mhm.
podcasts I listen to, like, typically have a level of, like, the host is add some, like, comedic aspects or will, say some funny things or, like,
They're
off the cuff
likable.
things. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And so I think that stuff is awesome because I'm like, "Wow, like, this isn't your typical, 'Hey, we were talking about this before, but it's like, "Hey, what's your story? How'd you get here? Why'd you do" like, although helpful questions establish the foundation, I think sometimes make it seem more like an interview versus a conversation. And I think in
Yeah.
general, the thing I love about I would say the archetypes I like are mainly it feels like I'm with them. I'm literally in the same room with them, hanging out. We're
Mhm.
just just riffing on things. And although I'm not saying anything, I feel like I'm included in that part. Kind of like we said, being a fly on the wall. And so it's super interesting that, in my opinion, I feel like the podcasts that are more unique are the ones that have maybe 2 or 3 co-hosts, different people that,
Yeah.
expect different personalities, and then they can just riff from there.
I think to follow up though, I do think curiosity makes sense in those, couple of people sitting around a table, kind of conversational podcasts as well. I do listen to a lot of NBA podcasts. That's like my more fun, you know, if I'm maybe struggling to focus on, maybe something a little more productive, um, as I'm driving or, walking or running or working out or whatever it is. Um, I do love an NBA podcast. And what have found really interesting is, even in those conversations where the guys know each other, the people have built a relationship, and maybe they haven't, but the thing they have in common is like their interest in the NBA in the first place. And so I feel like there is still a lot of curiosity as far as like, am I the only one who thinks this makes sense? Like I would rank, I would rank Magic Johnson above Larry Bird. No, wait,
Mhm.
that doesn't make why would you do that? Because when I think about, like there's so much of that back and forth that I think that is more human. That's probably more natural than if I'm sitting here and you're saying, okay, and where did you go to school? And then I answer you. Um, and so I like when I say curiosity, I definitely mean it from, that human perspective. When you meet somebody and they're like particularly curious in your story, like that makes you want to engage with them and relate with them, not like give yes or no answers. So I think that's more likely to build relationship is that curiosity part of that.
Yeah, and even too, like you kind of mentioning sports, the initial thought I have from that perspective is there's a reason why Pat McAfee's one of the biggest podcasters in sports because, in my opinion, they bring the different personalities, different entertainment factors, like and obviously they're kind of off the cuff. They don't mind
Mhm.
ruffling the. They even called out one of the executives within ESPN, kind of sharing that, and so I think in general, people are craving a very like real and raw environment for content, like
Yeah.
podcasting, things like that. And so I think in general, the more and more people lean in that more kind of personality, personable, conversational environment, kind of even off the cuff sometimes, people are attuned to that, in my opinion.
Like I think, well, here's more philosophical thought. We as humans are built for connection. Like I think we want that innately. Um, when I think about when you were talking, it made me think about you know how actors have to do like a press junket for an upcoming movie. And so they're like sitting in a room, and then it's, like 100 or maybe more. I don't know how many people they end up doing, but it's like different journalists, different folks who come in and interview them for like 5 minutes, just like to get their bit of content. And what like a certain type of clip that I've become really fond of, like that I feel like I relate to a lot, is when it's somebody comes in and they ask like a real question, and it catches those celebrities or those folks who have been interviewing all day and saying the same things. It catches them off guard for the like, thank you, like nobody asked me that. And then they like give a real answer. And so I feel like, just because, like you're Leonardo DiCaprio or something like that, it doesn't change like your interest in like need to feel like a human. And so I think what's so fun and really why it makes like the fly on the wall thing work so much is when you listen to a podcast, and if you listen to it for a long time, if you've followed a lot of episodes, you've stayed really connected to who the hosts are, you like catching up when they have repeat guests, you feel like you know those people. It's not that, well, not only do I know how they feel about the particular topics that they talk about, but it feels like I know them. And so if I were to run into somebody from a podcast that like I followed, unless they're like a big giant star elsewhere, I would probably, my initial thought would be like, "Oh, I know that person." Wait, actually, I don't know that person. Well, I know them, but they don't know me. And so I think podcasts specifically offer that like level of intimacy, but interview podcasts do not.
Yeah, for sure. So yeah, I know that we've, kind of been unpacking and even deconstructing aspects of what, make a really good podcast compelling and enough to, for people to tune in and listen to. And for those of you that have listened up to this point, may be thinking, who is this Alex guy? Like who is he? What's he about? How did he get here? And so to kind of begin to unpack more of your story journey into what you're doing now, I want to refer to a post you made a few months ago talking about your
Mm,
transitional points in your career. And so I'll read the part that the snippet of the post, and then we'll go from there. So the post said January through May, and the quote was fine, just figuring it out, just figuring out the next move here at BuildWit. Then it says May to June. Oh, everything is on fire for me. I no longer work at the company I was obsessed with. July through August. I have absolutely no idea what I want to do with my career. September to October. I guess I can be a consultant for podcasts and construction. November to December. I want to build a great business and I have a clear vision for what that is. So, in my
mm,
opinion, I think that's super interesting because you kind of bring us into the mind frame that you were in from, transitioning out of your previous job and now going into what is now Alex Horton Creative within this podcasting production agency.
yeah,
But the reality is when people look at it from afar, they're like, oh wow, that's awesome. Like it makes sense. He has his own business. But the reality is you were going internally through all these different things through this season. And
yeah.
so my question, kind of as I laid that as a foundation, is how did you get here and why are you sticking with podcasting?
Hmm. The podcast story for me is really interesting. So, um, the first podcast I ever listened to, which like this is not like in the beginning, but the first podcast I ever listened to that I have any like real memories of was it was called the Nerdist podcast, and it was with shoot, I can't remember his name, but it was just like a dude who lived in LA, was really well connected with a lot of celebrities, that kind of thing, and they were these long form podcasts where they would just start recording when they got in the room, and they just start talking. And almost every episode, whoever the guest was would say, um, "Oh, are we recording?" He's like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." And I just loved that. Like I thought that was so great because like that's so disarming. I feel like it locks people up if you say, "Okay, are you ready? All right, record." And we're back now with a new, like, that's so hard for, I think, so many people because they're like, okay, well, what do I do? And they're just waiting for the first question versus it's already a conversation going. So that was like a thing that was like printed on my heart of like, that's awesome. I love that. Um, and so, I was probably listening to that 10 years ago. And I was working as a musician, not really sure what I wanted to do as far as a music career. I tried a bunch of different things. Um, the quick story of that is I thought I moved to Nashville. If you've ever been to Nashville, there's a big country music scene. Now it's just all music scene, but specifically country music scene downtown at like the honky tonk bars. And that was like the most obvious thing in terms of what to like pursue. So I started doing that, like playing these 4-hour gigs, playing the same like cover songs. And I said, this is not for me. When I'm playing original music, then I'll be happy. And then I got into a couple bands that was playing original music. And then I said, once I'm able to, play a part in writing the music, then I'll be happy. And then I did that and was with a band and then started my own thing. Um, and then said, when I am in charge, then I'll be happy. And then went through that. And, guess what? Like I wasn't. Like it did not do the thing for me that I just had dreamed my whole life that it would. And so I got to like my late 20s, so 26, 27, and said, well, now what? Because I have done all the things I wanted to do. It's like I toured in Europe for 5 weeks with a band. Like that was amazing. And I quit the band when I got home because I was
Mm.
like, that's not it. Actually, turns out what I thought it would be. That's not it. Um, and so I ended up going back to school for software and web development. I was a worked as a professional software and web development a software developer, web developer
Mhm.
for 4 years, and was with an agency, worked at a couple companies, and then I was with an agency here in Nashville. That was great. I wasn't looking to leave. It was a fine job. There was plenty of opportunities to like just continue getting better at what I was doing. And then I had seen a post for a company called BuildWit on LinkedIn, and I just read it and really related to it. It was a company that was doing marketing and media for construction companies, and I'm like, that is so unique and interesting. I'm just going to send a message, and I think it was a job. Like I think it was a job listing, but did have contact information. And so instead of like applying, because I didn't really need a job, it was more like this is just I just want to talk to this person. And so I sort of just wrote like my story and said like, hey, I'm also not like a typical software internet guy. Like I already have dirty boots. I've worked some you know, blue collar, at least just like demanding physical jobs early in my 20s. Um, and I just feel like this is really interesting and maybe I could be a part of it. I'm not really sure. And so I just like essentially he called me the next day and then the company was so new. I think there were 5 employees. My interview was just, hey, talk to all 5 of these people on the phone. Like, all right, fine. And so did that, came out with them a couple months later. Um, and so was for a year was building and working on their websites. They had contracted all that stuff out for years before then. So like there was a lot of just fixing and figuring out how to manage some things that were built by other people. But it was all in construction. And so that was really like my introduction to construction or working with construction companies. After about a year of that, there was an opportunity. The CEO, founder of BuildWit, Aaron Witt, had called me one night and said, "Hey, you know about microphones, right?" And I might be paraphrasing there, but it's essentially that was the question. And I said, "Sure." And he said, "Hey, would you produce our podcast?" Um, I don't know that I had listened to it at that point. Um, I'd been with the company a year. He'd been running the podcast for a year. I was just like never even considered it. And so he said, "Hey, can you produce this and just like level up, you know, make the quality better? We want to introduce video when we can. Can you help us just make this a better product?" And so I said, "Sure." I've only ever listened to podcasts. I've never worked on a podcast, but that sounds really interesting. Sure. And so I jumped in, and I think what was helpful is I had this context for how to just like make the quality better from like a tech perspective. So it was nice to have like a big fat win immediately. Was like already sounds better. Like that's done. I, sat down and like made recorded like custom music for the podcast instead of using what was like, royalty free music or something like that. Um and so like it was like, oh, this is exciting. I see something here. And then we I built that business for 2.5 years. Um so it's been a lot of podcasting, and specifically in construction.
So there's two things I want to say from the get. You mentioned you're paraphrasing the first question that Aaron asked you. Hey, do you know anything about microphone? Or you know stuff about microphones? And then your response was sure. I thought you were saying
Sure.
sure.
SH. Da-doom.
I was honestly hoping you were gonna tee that up. I thought that's why you responded that way. So just for
That's a
those of
good
you
one.
that
I'm gonna keep that for the next time I give that story. That's good.
exactly when you give that story, then for those of you listening, there's a mic brand that both me and Alex are using called Shure, Shure. So that's why I
Mhm.
said that. The other thing though, it's interesting because it reminds me a lot of my career within construction too. Like specifically within marketing, like I became an
Mhm.
in-house marketer for a commercial sub here in Washington, and yeah, I had some know-how about, some photos. I had a camera. I had a Canon 80D. I had obviously experience with music. I was also a musician. I know both you and I have connected on that piece. So from a technical aspect, I had the experience. However, from the content and all sort of stuff, I kind of had to figure it out as I go. And so as I hear your own story, because you mentioned you went to school, back to school for, development, all that sort of stuff, but you didn't go necessarily for the podcasting
Mhm.
perspective. I'm curious, considering you didn't have maybe the proper training or whatever people would call that. And I honestly think that you don't need proper training. I think it's something you learn as you go. But
Yeah.
I'm curious, what are some of the lessons that you learned along the way, kind of learning as you went? Because you had the technical ability, you had the technical know-how, you had all that, even the musical experience, all that sort of stuff.
Mhm.
But what were some of the biggest lessons you learned along the way in actually building a great podcast?
Hmm. I think it makes it a lot easier if you have a really clear North Star, like for your purpose. Um, that business specifically, like the tagline that's on the wall that is in neon lights is, um, to make the dirt world a better place. And so it was really easy to be like, that's the thing. So whatever we do here, it just has to be aimed towards that, which made it easier. I don't want to say easy. It made it more tangible to find, hey, what are some things that move the needle that make this better if we know that our work is towards like a particular mission. Um, so that was a big part of that, was just kind of knowing, if the whole point is that, then we can focus on, how do I level up my own skill set? How do we just get better at having valuable conversations that other people can get something from. Um, Knowing that like it was to serve people in a specific industry. Um, but I think in terms of like really learning what made a good podcast, um, I mean, so much of it is tr- trial and error is some of that, sure. Um, but I do think I've used this analogy before. You get photographers, when they first start out, they're like, "What do I take photos of? Like, what do I even take photos of? I don't know. Like, other than just like my kids or my whatever." But then the more you do it, the more like refined your eye is to go take more photos. And you take more and more photos, and then you start noticing more and more things. So I think that also applies to, just stories in general. And so I think always really thinking of, let's get the technical part dialed in, and always be thinking in story so that you never get kind of tied up in the weeds of, uh are we putting out enough Instagram reels for the episode, or like all those things are important, sure, if however you're trying to grow, whatever your strategy is, but it was just like we want this to look and sound great. And however that is right now, like it's not going to be as good as it will be in 6 months. So we know we can always improve those things, but like having that tech thing and then also be thinking about story, it just made it a lot easier to have like a direction, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's really interesting that you're mentioning, yeah, and us even kind of talking about the tech side and, both being a musician as well as now, on the content side and media
Mhm.
side. And you had a post about this recently about gear. Like you had
Mhm.
mentioned how, hey, like as you've grown older, as you become more experienced, you realize that the gear is less what you're focused on and less realize that that matters. Although you could probably still riff on things and share your thoughts
Sure.
on pedals or equipment, all that sort of stuff. But the reason I'm saying this now is I want to ask you your thoughts on this. And I made a post about this recently, is saying I feel like a lot of people get stuck on what microphone should I have, what camera should I have, what setup. Although all those specific aspects are important for production value, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a good podcast. So, my question to you, with that in mind, is what actually makes a podcast good, specifically in construction?
Mm. What makes a podcast good specifically in construction? I would say a little more broadly, just before I like dive in a little bit more, would be I think working on a podcast idea where you are not clear on who it's for is kind of like spinning your wheels. Because I think there are a lot of folks who have said over the years to themselves, man, we should have a podcast. But like when you say that's for you, like that's not for anybody else.
Yeah.
And so I think on one hand, like, it's fun to joke about that. But I think if you're constantly making for you or like because it's fun to do, that's fine. But you don't have like a higher purpose for why you consistently do it when it's maybe not as fun. Um, and so when I think about what it takes to make a good podcast for a construction audience, um, being really focused on who it's for and what those type of folks would get value out of makes it a lot easier just to have a real conversation. Um, one of the things that really stuck out to me, as the person who monitored the dirt talk at buildwith.com email, was how many folks just loved the conversations with people who had like just started their business or who were 5 years into their business, but it was still really small. Like it was either that or somebody who had started a business 30 years ago and are now like enjoying the fruits of that labor over a long period of time. And the reason like they connected to that is because they could see themselves in it. Like they said, "Oh, that could be me." But I think at the same time, like the folks who listen who, have been in the industry for a long time, who have built something for themselves, they also like really resonated with those kinds of conversations because like there was like some nostalgia to that. Like I remember when we were having those problems, when we were trying to hire the first person that wasn't in our family. And so like with all of that construction content, it was just like, how do we talk to these people um, on a level where like yeah, that's me. I see myself in that conversation, in that person. Um, so I think that's not necessarily unique to construction, but I would say it could be particularly poignant for a construction audience. Um, I don't really know the stats of this, but this is just like from my heart that in construction there are particularly um, a lot of family run businesses. Obviously, there's family run businesses in every industry. However, it feels like there are a particular percentage of family businesses where they've maybe even had more than one generation, um, be the head of the company. And so, like when you talk to those people, or when you talk about those people or about those experiences, there's so like much emotion tied up in those conversations that like, yes, where they work is great and they've made a really great living. But like when you get somebody who, his is the third generation of their family who runs the business, like they're probably not thinking that much about money at this point. Like if they've really grown the business, the thing they're thinking about is, I want to take care of this business for my family the way that we've always taken care of it, which is like really caring for people. Like it's like those sorts of conversations, and never, how can we squeeze a little bit more margin out of it? And so I think, of course, there are plenty of podcasts that are really um, about like that money, that business side. But I think when talking about and to folks in construction, um, it is a very, human endeavor because, like, that work is often really tied into, like, their own identity,
Hmm.
if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I'm interested now in hearing, because obviously you'd mentioned like just aspects that may make a good construction podcast. So I feel like the norm, as far as what I see within the industry, when somebody starts a podcast, is more along the lines of, we're just gonna start a podcast and there's no rhyme or reason. We're just gonna have different people. We're just
Mhm.
gonna talk.
Yeah.
And although I think I'll always encourage a contractor to start a podcast, because I think it still is such an underutilized aspect for any company.
Yep.
I think for the podcast that we were referring to earlier, the ones that may feel like they're off the cuff or more, raw and human, they do have a level of structure to them. Like
Mhm.
this isn't like we're just bringing somebody random talk about whatever. No, there is and obviously they're at a certain level of experience where they're able to
Sure.
obviously hold the conversation, but keep people entertained and engaged the whole time. So my question to you is, what is so the parameters? So let's say we have one side is super broad, like, you interviewed tons of different people. It could be employees, it could be clients, it could be other people that offer you services. Things like I've seen contractors do that. So there's that spectrum. But then there's the other spectrum where it's like more niche and more specific to a like, hey, this is what the goal is, hyper specific. Where do you think you would fall, as far if you were to advise a contractor on where they should fall within that spectrum?
Mm.
Where do you think that balance is? Because I think you don't want to be super rigid and all the time, but at the same time, you don't want to just have chaos as well. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that.
That's a great question. I think there is definitely, I think some of that, how that format shakes out is related to, who is hosting in the first place. I think some of it does flow from, like what feels really natural to you. But I would say that like there is, it is really a this is not that helpful yet. There is a lot of value in finding that balance because like that's probably what a normal conversation that's not recorded is. Like if I'm having lunch with somebody that I've been really been wanting to meet, like we've been texting, I'm not going to write out 10 questions to ask them, but I'm going to be thinking about our conversation beforehand.
Mm.
I'm not going to show up and be like, okay, what do I think of this person? Why did like I'm clear on that information, which like I think inherently brings structure to the conversation. So as far as like finding the balance between, we're just going to show up and talk, and we're going to write down every single thing we talk about. It's almost like getting really clear on what the problem the podcast is meant to solve, and then you kind of muscle your way through what feels really natural that actively serves that solution, if that makes sense. So I guess I wouldn't say that there is a happy medium that you should go after, but I think it's like if you are really clear on why would we even start a podcast? Like what is the problem we're trying to solve? If you're clear on that, I think it becomes a lot easier to then decide, how is each episode supposed to feel if you know what it's supposed to do already. I just think that gets easier.
Yeah, for sure. It is kind of like I think it's good to have a starting point, but over time
Mhm.
you'll kind of figure out, based on personalities, based on cadence, based on natural chemistry with whether it's hosts, co-hosts, or even to other guests. you'll kind of start to develop that identity. But yeah, I think over time there is no, maybe there is no silver bullet, but and honestly, I can definitely see both sides. Like one side, super chaotic, eventually get structure because over time you realize, okay, these conversations, although maybe good, they're not super helpful. Maybe the audience is not resonating. So let's hone it in a little bit versus more strict on, hey, this is what we're doing, and then eventually you kind of blossom into something that maybe the audience wants, and maybe that is the underlying piece is based on your listenership, based on what the feedback that you get, like I think that kind of indicates, hey, what direction you should go. It's like, hey, what do
Mm.
people want? And you even led with that. When people say, hey, we're going to start a podcast, it typically starts more from a selfish sort of standpoint. Hey, what's interesting to me versus what would be interesting to the listener? Because at the end of the day, you're creating a podcast to be able to help educate and entertain or inspire the people who are listening to the content. Going back to like construction companies and podcasting, I wanted to ask you this. So like, so you have your own company now, helping contractors do this. Why should a construction company start a podcast? Like they have a million other things on their plate.
Mm.
I struggle with making a case for social media because I have a agency doing that for contractors. And so like when you think of the array of things that a contractor has on, as far as priorities, initiatives, objectives, why should podcasting be one of them?
Hmm. The reason that it makes sense, or the reason that it can make sense for a construction contractor or really any sort of like blue collar business with a certain level of employment, probably, certain amount of employees, maybe that's 50, maybe that's 100. Um, the reason that it makes sense is, you can't be everywhere at once as a leader. Like you
Mm,
have to you have to scale yourself somehow.
yeah.
Um, to me, it's less about like a podcast. Like the more that I've gotten into this and really like dug into, um, I certainly, I'm not having conversations where it's like, hey, you should start a podcast and here's why. Like that's not the kind of conversations I'm having with either my clients or prospective clients. Like that is not the conversation. It's, hey, here's like my problem. And essentially podcast technology can help solve that. So, one of those problems is probably, um, the person who started the business uh, can no longer go out and meet everybody on the job site anymore. Where they used to hire everybody, and they used to, when we hired a new person, I'd go out there and I'd bring burgers and I'd get to know the new guy. Well, like eventually you can't do that. And then you don't even, eventually it grows more. You can't even name off the top of your head, what all are your active jobs like that's just the nature of the business. You have to get higher and higher above the fray, which is important, and the business requires that of the of leaders, of their, the executives. But at some point, as like an executive of a construction company specifically, because like so many of their employees are, for lack of a better word, remote. Like it's always been remote. They're not in the office. They're out in the field doing the work. Um, like they are not getting FaceTime with the boss. And so, like, how do you humanize the leader? Maybe that's one word I would use. Not that you have to make them pre- pretend to be a certain way, but it's like, how do you make that person look like a human and show that they are just like a normal person, like everybody else in the business, and that like their role is to do what they're doing and not, um, you know, they're sitting in their office with their feet up, just like counting the money as it comes in while everybody does the work for them. So I think that is one major uh, value add from doing something like a podcast. Um, I feel like it's almost like leveraging podcast technology, especially if it's internal, because it's really just content. Like at the end of the day, you can call it a podcast, but it could just be a video conversation. Like we did when people would talk and they had cameras on and microphones. You didn't call it a podcast before podcasts existed. It was just an interview or it was just a video. Um, and so to me, I almost think of it a little bit more old school that way sometimes, where it's just kind of to solve a problem from a communication perspective. So that's one piece. Another reason is it establishes you as a leader, as a thought leader, as an expert. And I don't even mean that from like an influencer level. I think there is a lot of talk and buzzwords around like you need to establish yourself as an authority in your space, which is true. And like we're both trying to do that and working to do that each day. That's part of the game. But I think like even just internally, if your team is really clear on like my leader knows their stuff. Like they're not out here in the field anymore, but they really understand what it takes and what it's like to be here.
Mm.
I think is super super valuable, and there's no amount of memos that are gonna do that work for you. So it kind of makes it so that like your team sees you like, oh, they know what they're doing, they have expertise in this, and they've been like me in one way or another, and now they just their role is something different now. um because I do think like there is definitely that tension, between field and office and construction. um and I've never I've worked, I've cleaned up pools and I've done landscaping and things like that. I've never, worked out in the field, but I've certainly spent a lot of time with people both out in the field and, directly communicating about like these sorts of issues with folks in the industry. And, so many people talk about like there is just like that inherent tension between like the field and the office. And by like the leader, I think like extending, uh, a communicative olive branch like to the entire organization being like, I understand what it's like to be out there. I think it makes it a lot easier to just have hard conversations through the organization because like it's modeled, from the top that like, we talk about what we know, and we also like ask questions about things we don't know. So it just I think establishes expertise for leaders, but also gives them an opportunity to model like not appropriate behavior, but like, hey, if we're going to be a serious business, if we're going to continue to grow, if we're going to make ourselves better, like we have to be really upfront about the things we don't know, so that we feel comfortable asking those questions. So I feel like a podcast can really help serve those two goals. Just because like it makes the business better. I don't really think there's many arguments that say that doesn't make the business better, but like it, it's just more like, um, is communication enough of an issue at our business that we see it's causing problems in other parts of what we do? And if the answer is yes, then a podcast is a great way to start because it's not nearly as labor or capital intensive as, let's hire a video team or something like that. It's something a lot smaller that you can get going, um, and have really big impact.
Hmm. Yeah, I think there's definitely I would say based on your response there, the overarching theme seems around people, seems around culture, those sort of things, which when it comes to any executives like top priority list, like culture and people is probably one of the top ones
Yeah.
considering labor shortage, considering like not only the lesser amount of talent that a contractor has, but also too knowing that a recruiter is probably reaching out to your people every single day, literally saying, "Hey, I have this offer, I have this opportunity here." And it's like, how do you make a case for someone to stay in your company? And to piggyback off what you said, I think it's building an internal construction company podcast. Because what happens, I would say, because I worked in house for a contractor, and I don't think it's a bad thing. They would have internal weekly meetings, and I thought that it was great. The leadership would share maybe a leadership takeaway or something that that's kind of a nugget for the entire team as far as unifying, showcasing where they're going, other aspects, kind of housekeeping things, and I thought it was great. But the caveat there was 75% of the employees weren't there though. Only 25% of the office, like, because which is makes up the entire office staff were there, but the
Yeah.
employees on the field did not have any knowledge or recollection of what happened because they weren't there. And so my question to you now is, let's say there's a contractor out there that does have like a rhythm, whether it's like a daily huddle or
Mm,
maybe even like a weekly team meeting or something like that, or maybe a quarterly all hands meeting. What are your are you for or against a contractor how to, yeah, are you opposed or against a contractor documenting or recording those conversations and using that as podcast content? Because the way I'm thinking about it from this perspective is obviously a leader's
mm,
preparing for that conversation. They may have
yeah.
like a specific note or takeaway they want. And for me, I'm always thinking through the passive least resistance. And so that's my thought is like, hey, if you want to start a podcast, that might be an avenue to begin the process for that. But I'm curious on your thoughts, maybe as it relates to the content perspective or maybe even the technical aspect. Do you think that could potentially be a viable way for a contractor to get their foot in the door?
So I think that's a great question about, using all hands meetings as podcast content. Um, I think that a lot of companies, and this is not specific to construction, but I would say there's a good percentage of businesses in construction who probably think this way. That the way that they do things in terms of performing the work is is a methodology they should protect. And I think
Mhm.
like the best businesses in construction probably are not all that concerned about the methodologies they use to perform the work. Like it's probably all kind of the same. You might have particular techniques, like one of the companies I work with, they do horizontal drilling, and you know, not a lot of companies do what they do, and like they do some hand mining, like it's really unique stuff. But they're like talking about that constantly, and they've had an internal podcast, and we're working on you know, building that and leveling that up. But it's that stuff like they're always talking about externally. Like that's not a hidden thing. Um, but I think where people especially, I don't wanna say, like, more old school thinking, but, hmm,
Old school thinking.
old school thinking, uh, would say, like, we can't that can't be shared, like, that can't be recorded, because that would hurt our business somehow. When, like, if the differentiator in your mind is that, um, we have the best equipment or something like that, or our our trench digging techniques are the best. Like I just feel like that it's really hard to set yourself apart, and that's probably not the thing that actually does set you apart. Um, and so I feel like any sort of negativity that could possibly come from, having like an all hands meeting that's internal, having that recorded, whether that's somebody hears it and then leaves your business and tells another business what you said or something like that, any sort of negative outcome that could lead to is going to be overwhelmingly um, pushed aside by like the positive benefit of having more direct communication with your company. Like I just don't see, and like some of this is probably my own naivete. Uh, I just don't see the problem with if everybody like knows it's going to be recorded and you're coming in as a leader saying like this is information my team needs. And if you're not open to being if you're not open to it being recorded, that means that you apparently don't want the people who can't be there to know. And instead, if it's like I'm showing up and I've prepared whether it's remarks or just I'm giving a presentation on these couple things, we're just giving it, want to talk about, we're acquiring this small business that does this thing, or we're starting a new division, or we got this major job that's the biggest job we've like whatever those things are. Like that's important for your people to know and understand. And if they get that on a printout the next day instead of getting to hear you speak about it, and like if it's a big deal for your business, you're going to act like it's a big deal for your business. You're going to speak on it in a way that like you really care, and the value your team's going to get hearing you speak on something that you really care about is much higher than the information if you just typed it out in a document and sent it as an email. So as far as recording something like that as like a way to get in the door, like of course you should. You should record any meeting that would have real value to the people who are not in the room. And I don't necessarily know that all of those would have like the biggest audience in the world. But when you start an internal podcast, the audience is probably just the people in your business. And if they get major value out of that, then the cost to get going probably doesn't matter. At the time you'd be like, that microphone's $400. Like, yeah, like sure. That's a thing that you could get stressed about in the early running. But like it I think when you think of it in terms of like what kind of value is my team getting if they hear from me uh s- you know speaking truthfully about what like I want for our people in this business. If my company hears that from me once a week for a year, do you think they're going to believe me? Like probably. They're more likely to believe me than not, certainly. And so I think like if you can get on board with my company gets value out of hearing me speak the truth about what's going on in our business, then you should be recording everything that the company needs to hear.
Dude, you have so many things. I'm firing off so many things that what you just said there. There's a lot of stuff. The first thing I'll say, you mentioned like the microphone, $400 microphone. It's crazy. I made a post recently on LinkedIn, and this guy, his name is Perrin. He's from Louisiana. He's a CMO for a construction robotics company, and he basically posted. I don't remember if it had to do with investing in marketing, things like that, or content.
Mhm.
He basically said it's crazy that a contractor will think twice about like a website that maybe costs them 10, 15, $20,000, but don't mind dropping 50, $60,000 on a brand new truck that maybe they didn't need right away, but they thought it looked nice or cool or whatever. And there will be
Yeah.
utility, but the thing though with the website is it lives like once you pay that, like yeah, you may have to have somebody maintain all that sort of stuff, but it's pretty minimal cost to like a car and all that sort of stuff. Both have incredible value, and so even going back to the $400 microphone, in my opinion, and going back to even recalling a conversation earlier, don't get bogged up too much on production value or quality, although it does matter. That's not the first thing you should focus on.
Mhm.
But as it relates to, even building a building or, digging up dirt, like whatever equipment you need to be able to perform the best quality work is what you'll need. And as it relates to podcasting, it's the same way. Obviously, you don't want to get bogged up there. But the point there is it's crazy how sometimes we justify certain things to be like, oh, that's just $400. Because $400 for me as a consumer sounds like a lot. It's like, okay, do I want to drop $400? But as a business owner or someone in business, you're like, $400, that's it to be able to get high quality, sounding audio. Of course, let's do it. Or hey, I have to pay this person to be able to set this up or do this. Or I'm like, no brainer. This is what I need. I know this is going to move the needle, but it's just crazy. Sometimes I feel as though we have a consumeristic, maybe more of a consumer mindset with that as it relates to us as an individual versus the business. That's one
I
thing. Go ahead.
sorry. Well, I was to kind of piggyback on that. Um, it's like the conversations that I have where their interest in working with me, if we never talk about equipment, then it's so easy to talk about fees because it's just like we're just working to solve a problem. Like that's the thing we're doing. And when it comes down to like, yeah, we want to start a podcast and we've already got like this camera, so let's just use that. Let's not like it just becomes more of a you're thinking about like the technical requirements it takes to get this thing moving. And instead, if you're thinking about um, we were able to keep five people more than we typically do from a retention rate perspective
Mm,
than the last 2 years. Like, of course, you would spend whatever that costs every single time for that. Um, and I'm not guaranteeing that outcome. It's there's many, but I think what's important, it's like if you're focused on uh, the costs of the equipment, then it's done. But if you're buying a solution to a problem, then that cost often doesn't even matter. You're like, yeah, of course I would pay that because it does X, Y, and Z. Um, and so yeah, I mean, like I think sometimes even like for myself when I'm thinking about equipment, like for my business that I need to buy, uh, I don't think about it the same as stuff I just want.
yep.
It's like I had to buy a new drill this week, and I'm like, well, man, the one I really want's like $30 more. So I'll get the cheaper one. Like it,
Yeah.
and I did that, and like it's sitting on the front porch right now. I'm excited to go get it. But like when I think about my business and the thing I'm spending for that, it's like, well, I need I'm looking at it right now. I need a a really solid tripod that like I know is gonna be really smooth when I move it, um, will be very level, and will feel really, really sturdy when I put my cameras on it. So I'm not thinking about, man, tripods are expensive. I'm thinking about I need a solution to the problem. And the
Mhm.
problem is protecting my equipment and making my experience better. So I feel like that like investment part of it, the more you get bogged down in the details, the more it feels silly, and the more like high level thinking you approach it. Um, it's something like, well, of course I would invest in that because it solves a problem for our business.
Mm. Yeah, I think getting the priorities straight and the outcomes and the benefits of what something you're investing in will give you, I think, helps put other things in context. Hey, it costs money to grow your business in any aspect, and this is just one of them. And it's crazy because like I feel like even a podcast setup is probably a minimal expense for any contractor at the end of the day, considering you just need a good mic, you need a good video setup, maybe some lighting, some other extra things. It's once you have it, it lasts forever. I mean, and especially like, sure, like that they have their SM 58. Like that thing is like a tank. Like that thing will,
Yeah.
survive anything. And so it's crazy that sometimes and we all go through this. Like I would definitely be I'd definitely be ignorant to not say that I also don't go through those rationale and be like, "Oh, should I do this? How much is it going to
Yeah.
cost?" But it's like, no, you have to refocus. Say, "Hey, why am I doing this? What's the value it's going to add at the end of the day for me?" Um, One of the things you mentioned though, going back to the like recording the conversations, the sales or not the sales, but the weekly huddles and all hands, those sort of environment, those sort of situations. And you mentioned, some contractors are resistant towards like maybe sharing some insider, stuff like that. Here's my hot and spicy take, and I have a post coming up on this. Contractors, there are no trade secrets. And if there are trade secrets, they're very granular, and it's very likely that most of people in your company don't even know what that is. There's probably a small group of people. So there's probably a chance you probably won't even share that to everybody because it doesn't always relate to everybody else. So that's the first thing. The second
Mhm.
thing, though, is when contractors or companies in general say, this is our secret sauce. And I'm here thinking, I'm like, what does that mean? I'm like, oh, I realized it doesn't really mean anything because when I ask, hey, what is your secret sauce? They're like, oh, well, they'll describe a lot of things that a lot of other contractors end up saying, and I'm like, there's no secret sauce. Then you're just describing what another contractor is doing as well. And I say these things to say and motivate, and sometimes maybe even like encourage you. And maybe this is a bad way to encourage a contractors by doing this call out, but to encourage contractors to step out of your comfort zone. Like, yeah, I feel like we feel like we're going to say the wrong thing at the wrong time, and then maybe legal or safety or all these other measures will have to be involved. I think all the risk aversion in construction, considering how risky of a business it is crazy to me from a content perspective, because I guarantee you that contractors probably have bigger risks going on a job site than they do maybe from a podcast standpoint. And the beauty of
Yeah.
even a podcast, you can edit stuff out. As like, let's say something you slip something or say something, you can always edit it out. And so to kind of resonate with what Alex was saying is, I definitely think more contractors should find ways to document content. It's not so much
Mhm.
creating content. It's like just find those avenues or pockets of meetings or situations, events where, a leader of some sort is sharing some sort of expertise or vision or mission or culture or where you're going as a company, and begin that kind of process for, podcast content.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I want to say that before I go to the next question, I want to see, do you have any response or anything else you want to add to that before we kind of go into the last part of this conversation to close it out?
So, have you heard of the "they ask, you answer" thing from Marcus Sheridan?
I've heard of him. I haven't heard that framework yet.
Okay, so his book, and he's like built like a pretty big business. He was a pools guy before he ever got into marketing and speaking. And basically, the idea is on his website, there is content for every single question a potential customer could have. So I'm working on a couple projects right now where we're gonna sit down and just like get a couple people in their company to sit and talk about, what are some like questions people consistently ask you about your business or the type of work that you do. Um, but I think what has always made so much sense to me is you can essentially do that just from like an internal perspective. It's just
Yeah.
like what do people not necessarily understand about your business? Yeah, and their employees there. Like I've got one client where we did an onboarding podcast series, and we just said like, "Hey, what are some things that are like important for everybody to understand?" And some of those things were, we did an episode on each core value, and we talked about like what the company wants for its people. Um, but like at the end of the day, it was just like, hey, what kind of information is really important to the leadership of this business that they wished everyone um, had a firmer grip on? And then you just make content about that. So,
Mm,
like, to go back to like the initial point, like, it doesn't have to be this big production in order to have value that matters to your team. And instead, it's like, what information would bring your people value? What would make them better at their jobs? What would help them understand their role in the organization, how their role impacts success? Like, I feel like once you start thinking about it that way, then it's like, oh, we could, look, we need to sit down and have a conversation about this and just record it so that our team kind of knows where we're coming from when we make these decisions. The field is wide open. Like you can go anywhere once you realize like, oh, we're just trying to find ways to more easily communicate things we wish our people knew. And then like
mm.
you can make whatever you want, because it's not when we need to make a documentary for every time we need to make an announcement. It's like, no, you either record it or you like film it, like people talking about it who know what's going on and why it's important for the team to know.
So my last question for you, Alex, as we close out this conversation, I know that there's a lot of other angles and perspective, like direction we could have taken this conversation, and hopefully, this is just one of many conversations we'll have in the future to kind of chop it up about podcasting, construction content, even LinkedIn, all these sort of things. I wanted to ask you, what are some of the podcasts in the industry in construction, and also too, even outside of construction, that you would recommend other contractors reference for inspiration, or just structure of their podcast? Like, I'll say both, because I know that we can gain industry experience, or like industry knowledge, or yeah, just from people doing the actual work doing it now, but then also too outside of the industry as far as format and just structure of the podcast. So yeah, it's kind of a two-parter: internal, like in construction, and as well as like not related to construction. What are some podcasts you'd recommend?
I've been lucky to connect with a lot of construction podcasters over the years. Um, and there are a lot of different kinds. Some of them are, maybe not through businesses. Like it might just be like what I'm thinking of is it's called Laying Foundations. Um, and it's two young guys, Walker, Walker Lott and Davis Hambrick. I think those are names.
Yeah.
And they were really young guys in the industry who were just like, hey, we care about this and we want to like grow. And they've been doing it now for like 3 years. Like it wasn't a thing, and then it was a thing. And so they're coming at it from like they're super young. They're like mid-20s, and they're interviewing people who have a lot to share, who you know really can like certainly help them, but help people like them understand the construction industry better. Um, Another one that I think is awesome, which I did help start this one, but I'm certainly I've not been in the driver's seat at any point. Is just the Berg podcast, Berg Construction, out of Pennsylvania. When we started it, it was really they did make their podcast public, but it was never really meant for people outside the business. The idea was just like, well, some people who are maybe connected to the business could listen to if they wanted. And so when it started, it was just like, hey, here's like the the three C-level executives, like, hey, let's just sit and we'll talk about some things that's going on in our business. They've been doing it for a long time. I mean, like they're maybe at
Mhm.
100 episodes.
Wow.
And I had a conversation with Brian, who's the CFO there, maybe a couple months ago, and he said, yeah, but it used to be just like content for our team, just like, hey, let's talk about why we take on special projects that are outside of our main thing. He's like, but it morphed into more like philosophical, um, you know, stuff about the industry or about business, like because they'd been doing it so often and so consistently for a long time, they kind of found a rhythm about what made sense for them. And like none of these podcasts have to be long, but like I think theirs kind of always sat at like 20 minutes, give or take. Um, and man, I feel like those two are both really interesting. Like I've got friends in the industry who lead other businesses who've listened to the Berg one and have gone and started their own podcast because they're just like, I can see how that would benefit my business. So like my friend Nick Parrish, he runs Burns Dirt out of Columbus, Mississippi. Um, and it was a family business. He joined, bought in, whatever. And they started a podcast maybe a year ago. And like maybe we had a conversation about his podcast, whether we're getting it off the ground. But I do like to think of it as like my grand podcast child, a grandchild, whatever that would be. Just because I'm like, I know that some of the podcasts he was listening to, and it's just kind of fun to know that like there is some level of influence there at some point. But as far as like format is concerned, I think shorter always probably works better. Um, Not that there's like not value and interest in like these big, wide ranging conversations, but I think if it's an internal podcast specifically, if you're putting out an episode a week that's 3 hours long, like your team's never going to listen to all of it. And so I think giving your team an opportunity to listen to or watch something that like they can work into their own life and their schedule, like they're more likely to engage with it if they can kind of do it on their own time and do it in the way that they want. Um, like I think that's why it makes sense to have an audio and a video version, just because like that gives your team two options to choose how they would want to engage with something. Like everybody knows how to watch a video on their phone now. That's not new. And there are also going to be people who are podcasters who are like, I'm going to listen to this while I'm driving, to my job. I got a lot of windshield time, so I'm going to listen to it when I get in the car at 5 a.m. to go where we're going. And like, you're giving your team opportunities to engage, and the more that your team's engaged, it almost doesn't matter how they're engaging with it, because like that makes them more likely to be involved in like the story of the business in the first place. So, I think short is good. Video and audio is probably the way to go. You can just use the audio from the video, obviously. And then as far as like setting it up, I think trying to be really concise about what you're talking about. I think there's value in just kind of being able to have a little bit of tangential points. It's a $5 word. Go off down rabbit holes. Maybe that's more appropriate. But I think if you make it really clear with your team or with your audience, like, hey, these are the kinds of things we're going to talk about today. It just manages their expectations, which is a great way to not let them down if you manage their expectations. But it's like, hey, this week's episode, we're just going to talk about, you know, why we pivot to doing snow work in the winter so that we never have to lay people off. Like if that's probably more than one episode, honestly, but like that's also a really specific use case that applies to one specific company, and everybody who listens to it is going to really care about the information. Um, but if it was like, hey, we're going to talk about that, and then we're also going to talk about why the boss loves chicken wing, it's just like something made up. Like that might be interesting to the people doing it, but just trying to find things that every topic that you kind of set out um, would be of value to the team. And then I think like where people maybe get more hung up on it than I necessarily would is like the actual format of the conversation. So like there's like the intro, and then first we're going to talk about this, and then we'll have a long conversation about this, and then at the end we like to have these little things. Like that makes sense, and we should be doing that. But I also don't think that's something that you have to nail on the first episode. I think just like when it makes sense to not do that and to try something else, with podcasts, you're probably doing it often enough that you can just try, and if it doesn't work, just don't do it again. Do something different. Um, so I think to me, I would say to encourage contractors who have some communication issues in their business or realize that like their team would get a lot of value with additional communication avenues, I would say don't feel like you got to nail it. Like jump in, share like what's going on with you, share how you are, share who you are, and allow your team to engage with that. Like, I think that's the first thing. It's just like be yourself, find things that your team needs to hear, um, and then just try to communicate it. Because I think teams probably also have a lot of grace for their leaders who maybe don't nail it in their podcast. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think they care as much as maybe some people might expect.
If you've enjoyed this conversation up to this point, if you like the points that Alex has made up to this point, if you like the sound of Alex's voice, if you like Alex's new haircut, which, hey, kudos, your barber did an incredible job.
Mm.
The beauty in all this, everything we just unpacked, is Alex does this for a living. He has a company called Alex Horton Creative where he helps construction companies on their podcast strategy as well as the production side. And so if you guys need more help, have more questions, or even just want to hop on a call to just see how it could potentially help, and as you already heard throughout this podcast, his goal is not so much on the utility of podcasting and more connected to what problem are you trying to solve, and then reverse engineering how podcasting might or might not be an avenue for you. And so I would definitely recommend that you guys check out alexhortoncreative.com. Is that correct?
That's it.
Yep. And then definitely follow him on LinkedIn. He's posting content there as well. Before we close out this conversation, Alex, is there anything else you want to plug, or any last thoughts on this conversation we had today?
Yeah, I would say a podcast is really like the big tool on the tool belt. That's not the thing. And I say that both for like what I'm bringing into conversations, but also the way that businesses should think about it. That when we have conversations with folks who are either trying to solve a problem in their business or see that there would just be a lot of value with a podcast or internal content in any way, the conversation is never about podcasty things. It's deeper than that, and it's usually, hey, we're going to wield what's essentially a podcast um, to serve our people and to make our business better. That's the way that I'm thinking about it in the first place. So I think just like to encourage like those businesses, like you care about your people, and like you want to communicate with them, and you know that they want to hear from you. And so like a podcast is just a great way to do that in a natural way that folks are already typically accustomed to engaging with. Obviously I want to have conversations, like, if there's something I can do to help, great. But also I think just the concept of better communication makes businesses better. And, certainly the world I want to live in is one where there's less unsaid things that you know would I'm gonna phrase that last point because I know it in my heart. And the world that I want to live in is one where it's a lot easier to say what's real and be authentic with one another than just kind of assume people know how I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, what I know. So a podcast is a great way to do that. And it's a great way for me to get to know you a little bit better, Jonathan.
Yeah, and I was gonna say too, even that advice that you gave as far as like saying the things that you need to say, maybe not always saying it. I feel like that applies to marriage too. But this is not a marriage
Amen.
podcast, so we will not go down that route. But dude,
Yeah.
thanks so much for coming on the pod. I'm sure that this will be one of many more conversations. There's a lot of other things that I wanted to cover. However, I know that we definitely wanted to make this more conversational and honestly just practice what we've been kind of talking about, is make it more entertaining. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, thanks again for sharing your insight. And yeah, I look forward to following your growth as well as having more conversations in the future.
Thanks, Jonathan. You're a good friend, man. Look forward to keeping working on stuff with you.